The first time Adelaide Merriweather fired a rifle, she was 14 years old and standing over the body of a rattlesnake that had come too close to her mother's vegetable garden. And the second time, she was 26 and standing at the front door of her own homestead, daring anyone in the territory of New Mexico to tell her she could not keep it. That was the year 1883, and the land around the town of Cimarron was the kind that demanded everything from a person and offered back only what they were willing to bleed for. The sky stretched wide and bruised purple in the mornings, the red rock mesas cutting the horizon like the blade of a knife, and the wind came through the high desert in long, dry sighs that pulled at a woman's skirts and loosened the pins from her hair if she was fool enough to wear them. Adelaide was not fool enough for much. She had learned that early, and she had learned it hard. Her father, Thomas Merriweather, had staked the 160 acres under the Homestead Act in 1874, carried his wife and his 2 daughters out from Missouri in a wagon that groaned under the weight of everything they owned, and spent 9 years breaking that land with his bare hands and a plow that needed mending every other season. He had been a stubborn man, thick-shouldered and quiet, with a habit of solving problems by throwing himself at them until one or the other broke. Adelaide had inherited that particular quality, though she had long since decided it was a virtue rather than a fault. Her mother, Clara, had died in the winter of 1879 from a fever that moved through Cimarron like a ghost, touching some houses and skipping others with no logic anyone could explain. Her younger sister, Nell, had married a man named Robert Sutton from Taos in 1881 and moved away with her 2 small children, and her father had gone quiet after that in a way that was different from his usual quiet, a kind of going out of himself that Adelaide had watched with a helpless ache and could not cure with anything she knew how to do. Thomas Merriweather had died in March of 1883, not dramatically, not in some way the dime novels would have approved of. He had simply sat down in his chair after supper one evening, and his heart had stopped. Adelaide found him in the morning when she came in from the hen house, still sitting there with his boots on and his coffee cup on the table beside him, and she had stood in the doorway for a long time before she crossed the room and pressed her fingers to his neck and understood. She had buried him herself, beside her mother, on the rise above the creek. She had done it without asking for help. That was not pride exactly. It was something older and more practical than pride. It was the understanding that when you lived on the edge of everything, you had better learn to do things alone, because the alternative was waiting for someone who might not come. She kept the homestead. There were people in Cimarron who told her she could not, and people who told her she should not, and a man named Harold Graft who ran the general store and fancied himself the unofficial voice of the town's common sense, who sat her down in the one good chair in his store and explained, with the patience of a man who had never once in his life considered that a woman might have her own opinion, that running 160 acres alone was not a suitable occupation for an unmarried woman of 26. Adelaide had listened to him finish, thanked him for the coffee, and ridden back to her land on the bay horse she'd named Conquest, which was perhaps its own kind of answer. She grew what the land would allow: corn, beans, a small kitchen garden, some alfalfa for the 3 horses and the 4 cows, and the flock of chickens that ranged free and drove her slightly mad. She sold what she could at market and traded for what she needed and went without the rest. She repaired her own fences and patched her own roof and hauled her own water when the creek ran low, and she did it all with the same stubborn, purposeful competence that she had learned from her father and refined through years of necessity. She had a reputation in Cimarron, which she was aware of and largely unconcerned with. The women thought her odd and perhaps a little pitiable, though they would not have said so to her face. The men mostly left her alone, which was exactly what she wanted, though occasionally one of them got it into his head that what she actually wanted was rescuing, and those conversations tended to end badly for the man. She was not unhappy. She told herself this regularly and believed it with about 70% of her heart. The other 30% she kept in a locked room inside herself and never examined too closely. She did not need anyone. She had decided that a long time ago, and the evidence of the past 4 years had done nothing to change her mind. And then Gideon Keene rode into Cimarron on a Tuesday in early April, on a gray horse with a white blazed face, and the entire careful architecture of what Adelaide Merriweather had built inside herself shifted 3 degrees to the left, like a door that has always hung slightly crooked, but only suddenly makes you notice it when someone opens it the right way. She did not know his name yet when she first saw him. She was at the market on the main street, selling eggs and a wheel of the hard cheese she'd learned to make from a book she'd ordered from a publisher back east, and he came around the corner of the livery stable and stopped in the middle of the street to read a folded piece of paper, blocking the path of a mule cart whose driver cursed at him in 2 languages. He moved out of the way without apparent hurry, tucked the paper into the pocket of his coat, looked up, and for one unguarded second before Adelaide looked back down at her eggs, their eyes met. He was tall, she noted that without meaning to, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of actual labor rather than show. He had a dark beard, close-cropped, and eyes that were, at this distance, some color between gray and green that she could not precisely determine. He wore a worn canvas coat, trail-dusted, and a hat that had been through weather. He did not look new to the country. He looked like a man who had been in it for a while and intended to stay. She looked back at her eggs. He did not approach her stall. She did not expect him to. Men who looked like that tended to go directly to the saloon or the land office or both, and whatever he was, drifter, ranch hand, surveyor, any of the dozens of varieties of man that passed through a territory town, she had no particular reason to think he would be different. She sold her eggs. She sold most of the cheese. She bought flour and salt and a paper of needles, exchanged a few words with Martha Calloway, who ran the dry goods store and was one of the only women in town Adelaide actually liked, and rode Conquest back to the homestead as the afternoon sun began its long western slide. She did not think about the man with the gray horse again that evening. Or at least, she was mostly successful at not thinking about him, which amounted to the same thing in practice if not in principle. She learned his name 3 days later, when she went to the land office to pay the quarterly taxes on the homestead, and found him standing at the counter ahead of her, his big hand spread flat on the surface as he spoke with Dan Hollies, who ran the office with the weary competence of a man who had been asked questions he couldn't answer for 20 years. "Keene," Dan was saying, writing in his ledger. "Gideon Keene, you said you're looking at the Parsons Creek parcel." "That's the one," the man said. His voice was low and even, with something in it that was not quite a drawl, more like words that had been turned over a few times before they were let out. "The 120 acres on the east side. That's good grazing land," Dan said. "Rocky in places. The creek's reliable up through July, then it slows some." "I've been out there," the man said. "Twice. It'll do." Adelaide stood back and waited, studying the map on the wall with studied indifference, listening to the sound of a man who already knew what he wanted and was merely completing the paperwork to confirm it. There was something in that she recognized, though she would not have examined why for anything. He turned when he was done, and she was, unfortunately, directly in his line of sight. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Good morning," she said, with exactly the tone she used for all strangers, civil, contained, offering nothing. He nodded once and went out the door, and she stepped up to the counter and paid her taxes and did not watch him go. But she noted, because she could not help noting things, that the Parsons Creek parcel was the land that bordered hers to the east, separated by a ridge of juniper scrub and a 1/4 mile of open grassland. If Gideon Keene was buying that land, he was going to be her neighbor. The thought sat in her chest like a small stone, not unpleasant exactly, which troubled her more than if it had been. He moved onto the parcel in May, which she knew because she could see his fires at night from her front porch, small orange sparks in the dark distance to the east, and because the sounds of hammer and wood carried on the dry air with remarkable persistence. He was building something, and he was building it fast, which told her he knew what he was doing. She went about her business and did not investigate. The first time they actually spoke at any length was in the second week of May, when two of her cows broke through the fence line along the eastern border and ended up on his land, grazing contentedly in the juniper scrub as though they had always intended this journey. Adelaide discovered this at dawn, tracked them through the sparse grass, and found them not merely on Gideon Keene's land but in the process of being gently herded back toward the fence line by Gideon Keene himself, who had apparently noticed them and set about solving the problem without fanfare or announcement. She stopped her horse. He looked up. "Morning," he said. He was on foot, moving easily through the scrub with the particular patience of a man who had done this before. "I counted 2. Were there more?" "No," she said. "Those are mine. I apologize." She paused. "I'll fix the fence this afternoon." "I'll help," he said. She opened her mouth to say that was not necessary, and he continued before she could. "I need to check my fence line on that stretch anyway," he said, with the same easy, unhurried tone he seemed to use for everything. 2 fence lines are easier to check when you're standing between them, not an imposition. It was so perfectly, utterly reasonable that she could not object to it without sounding foolish, which she suspected was intentional on his part, though his face gave away nothing. She pressed her lips together. "All right," she said. "This afternoon." He nodded once, the same contained gesture he'd made in the land office, and went back to herding her cows. They fixed the fence that afternoon, and it was, as he had said, efficient and practical. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, which she discovered and noted with cautious approval. He worked steadily, strong and unhurried, driving posts with a maul and stretching wire with competent hands, and when he spoke, it was about the fence or the ground or the angle of the posts. He asked twice what her preference was when there were 2 reasonable ways to do something, and accepted her answer both times without qualification. When they were done, he stepped back and looked along the line. "That'll hold," he said. "Thank you," she said, which was harder than it should have been, and she knew it. He looked at her then, not in the assessing way that men sometimes looked at her, calculating what she was worth, or how long she'd last alone out here, or whether she might be persuaded to be less alone, but simply as though she were a feature of the landscape he was trying to accurately understand. "Adelaide Merriweather," he said. "I've heard your name around town." "I imagine you have," she said. "They said you've run this place by yourself since your father died." He paused. "I thought I should know who was on the other side of my fence line." "And now you do," she said. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. "Seems like." He picked up his maul and his remaining wire and walked back toward his land, and she stood by the fence for a moment and watched him go, and then turned back to her own work with a feeling she could not name and chose not to try. The spring moved into early summer, and the days grew long and hot, and Adelaide fell into the rhythms of the season the way she always did, the work becoming its own kind of music, the body knowing what was needed before the mind had to think about it. She rose before dawn, worked until the heat of midday drove her inside, rested 2 hours, worked again until the light failed. She kept the irrigation ditches clear, watched the corn come up slow and stubborn, worried about the south pasture fence that needed replacing, and tried not to think too much about the quiet of the evenings. She saw Gideon Keene 6 more times in May, each time briefly, each time with the comfortable directness that seemed to be his natural register. He was building a house on the Parsons Creek parcel, not a grand thing, but solid, made of adobe and timber with a covered porch across the front, and she could see its progress from her rise when she rode along the eastern fence line. He was doing most of the work himself, though twice she saw another man with him, a younger man with sandy hair who turned out to be his younger brother Caleb, visiting from Las Vegas, which was not the city but the New Mexico town of that name, 100 miles south. She knew these things not from conversation with Gideon but from Martha Calloway, who knew everything about everyone in Cimarron and shared it freely in the way of a woman who considers information a public good. His family's from Kentucky originally, Martha told her over the counter in late May, wrapping Adelaide's order of thread in a small tin of beeswax. Came out west 6, 7 years ago. He was working cattle down in Lincoln County for a while. Lord knows what that was like, given everything that's been going on down there. She shook her head with the particular expression of a woman who had strong opinions about range wars. Saved some money, I suppose, and decided to settle. He's 30 years old, never married far as anyone knows. Martha, Adelaide said mildly. I'm just telling you facts, Martha said, without the slightest change in her bright, interested expression. Adelaide said nothing. He seems like a decent sort, Martha continued, entirely untroubled. Bought a round of drinks for Tom Sayers when Tom told him his barn burned. Didn't make a show of it. Just did it. Adelaide picked up her parcel. Thank you for the thread. He asked about you, Martha said, and her voice was perfectly neutral. When he first came in, asked who ran the Merriweather homestead. Adelaide paused at the door. What did you tell him? The truth, Martha said. That Adelaide Merriweather ran it better than most men would, and was not in the habit of asking for or accepting assistance she hadn't requested. Adelaide absorbed this. Good, she said. Thank you. He didn't seem surprised, Martha added, or put off. Adelaide went out the door and down the street and did not allow herself to attach any particular significance to that. In June, a trouble arrived that Adelaide had been half expecting since spring. Not the kind that came with guns or weather, but the kind that came with lawyers and ledgers, which in her experience was frequently worse. A man named Carlisle Drummond, who owned the Drum Ranch south of Cimarron, and who was in the process of acquiring as much of the surrounding land as he could manage through purchase, pressure, and occasionally a species of legal maneuvering that nobody in the county could quite prove was dishonest, but that felt like it was, sent her a letter through the land office. The letter was written in the smooth, careful language of a man who had paid someone else to write it for him, and had offered to buy her 160 acres at a price that was, and this was the audacity of it, reasonable. Not generous, but reasonable. Drummond apparently knew better than to insult her. The letter noted that the land would be put to productive use in the Drummond cattle operation, and that Miss Merriweather might find that her situation, and here the language became very delicate indeed, would benefit from the liquid capital that such a sale would provide, given the inherent challenges of solo agricultural operations in the territory. Adelaide read the letter twice, set it on the table, and went out to repair the south pasture fence. She did not reply immediately. She wanted to think about it, not because she was genuinely considering it, she was not for one moment, but because she believed in understanding things fully before she acted on them. She wanted to know what Drummond actually wanted, which might be different from what the letter said, and she wanted to know how hard he intended to push if she said no. She got part of her answer that same week, when she found one of her cows dead in the south pasture, not from sickness and not from a predator. The cow had been shot, neatly and deliberately, once behind the left ear. Adelaide stood over the animal for a long time in the early morning light. She felt the cold, flat anger that had always been her response to cruelty, not the hot, burning kind, but the kind that settled in her chest like iron and made her very quiet and very steady and very determined. She skinned the cow because she was not a woman who wasted, and she rode to the sheriff's office in Cimarron that afternoon and told Sheriff Dan Prout what she had found. Dan was a good man, a careful man, and a cautious one. He noted her report in his book and told her he would look into it, and she could tell from his face that he knew, and she knew that looking into it would not accomplish a great deal against a man with Drummond's resources and connections. You might consider, Dan said carefully, that an offer is on the table. I know one is, Adelaide said, and it will remain on the table unanswered. Dan studied her. You want to be careful, Adelaide. "I'm always careful," she said and went home. She found Gideon Keene at her fence line when she got back. He was on his side of it, ostensibly checking his own posts, but he straightened when she rode up and she could tell from the set of his face that he had heard something or seen something or both. "I saw a rider on your south pasture last night," he said, without greeting, without preamble. "Late, maybe 2 in the morning, I was up, couldn't tell who it was at that distance in the dark." Adelaide absorbed this. "What direction did he come from?" "South," Gideon said, "and that's the direction he went back." South was Drummond's land. "One of my cows is dead," she said flatly. "Shot." Gideon looked at her steadily. He did not make a sound of sympathy or outrage or the kind of protective male anger that would have annoyed her considerably. He just took in the information and held it. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. It was simple and direct and contained no implication that she needed him to solve anything. "Drummond wants to buy my land," she said. "He apparently intends to persuade me." "And you're not going to sell," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm not," he nodded. A long moment passed, the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable. "If you see anything else," she said, and paused, which was as close as she could come to asking for something, "I'd be obliged to know about it." "You'll know about it," he said. There was nothing gallant in it, nothing performative. It was just a straightforward undertaking, the way you might agree to close a gate. She rode back to her house, and the stone in her chest from before was there again, but it felt less like something foreign now, and more like something she was starting to recognize. The summer of 1883 in Cimarron was bone dry and occasionally tense, with the kind of civic friction that built up in small towns when certain men had too much money and too little restraint. The Drummond situation was not unique. He had applied similar pressure to 2 other small ranchers and 1 homesteader before Adelaide, and 2 of them had sold. The third, an old man named Fenwick, had held on but had recently been dealing with fence cuttings and water diversions that everybody suspected and nobody could prove. Adelaide kept her rifle cleaned and loaded and leaning against the wall beside her front door, which was where it had always lived, and she went about her work with the same methodical determination, and she was watched. She did not realize at first how much she was watched, not in the way of surveillance, in the way of presence. She would be working in the kitchen garden and become aware, without having looked up, that Gideon Keene was visible on his own land to the east, doing his own work, existing in the same landscape. She would be riding the eastern fence line and find that he had already checked the stretch along his side, and if anything looked wrong, he'd left a small mark, a stone on a post, a twist of wire, so she'd know to look more closely. She would go to market and find that when certain conversations drifted toward her situation in the way that uninvited conversations did, he was sometimes nearby, not intervening, not speaking on her behalf, but present in a way that somehow made those conversations shorter. He never helped her without asking. He never assumed. He never spoke for her when she was capable of speaking for herself, which was always. He did not, in any of the small ways that men sometimes did, attempt to reduce the space she occupied or the authority she held over her own life. He was simply, persistently, nearby, like weather that you noticed was benevolent. It was in July that she first invited him to supper. She had not planned to. She had been in the middle of cooking, a proper supper, rabbit stew with cornbread, because she had been given 2 rabbits by old Mrs. Yazzie from the Hickorea community east of town, who traded with her sometimes, and whose friendship Adelaide valued because Mrs. Yazzie was sharp and funny, and had strong opinions about horses. And she had gone to the well for more water and found Gideon at her fence line repairing a stretch that the June rains had softened on her side of the line. Because he'd asked her 2 days prior if she'd wanted him to get to it when she hadn't had time herself. She had said yes, which was not nothing for Adelaide Merriweather. "There's stew," she said, which was about as close as she could manage to an invitation. He straightened and looked at her. The summer evening light was the color of honey, and it caught on his face and made him look, for a brief moment, like something out of a painting, though she did not think this thought and certainly did not acknowledge it. "If it's no trouble," he said. "I wouldn't have said it if it were," she said. He washed at the trough and came inside, and the thing that surprised her most was not how comfortable it was but how natural. He sat at the table in her kitchen, which was a small kitchen, plain, practical, with her mother's old blue curtains still at the window, and he looked around it the way a person looks at a place they want to understand rather than to judge, and he did not comment on anything except to say that the cornbread was very good. "I've had worse," he said. "You've had worse than excellent cornbread," she said dryly. "I've had trail food for 6 years," he said. "Your cornbread is a revelation." She was surprised into a laugh, a real one, brief and bright, and then she looked back at her bowl because something in his expression when she laughed made her need a moment. "You were in Lincoln County," she said when she had recovered herself. "During the trouble." "I was," he said. He did not elaborate immediately and she did not push, and after a moment he said, "I came out here from Kentucky at 23, took work where I could find it. Lincoln County was work. It was also," he paused, searching for the word, "a lesson in what happens when men with power decide the law doesn't apply to them." "A lesson I'm receiving myself," she said. "You are," he said. Drummond's a smaller version of what was happening down there. Men like that believe that persistence is the same thing as right. He looked at her directly. "They're wrong." "I know they are," she said. "I know you know," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze without aggression or challenge, just steadily, the way he did everything. "Most people who come to tell me about Drummond come to tell me what I should do," she said. "I haven't told you what to do," he said. "No," she said, "you haven't." The word hung there between them, occupying a space that was about more than Drummond, and they both felt it and neither of them did anything about it. And then Adelaide stood and took the bowls to the wash basin, and the moment resolved back into evening. He helped her wash the dishes without being asked, and without making a thing of it, and left before dark with a quiet "Good evening, Miss Merriweather." And she stood at the door and watched him walk back across the eastern pasture in the last light and felt, for the first time in years, the specific kind of loneliness that only arrives when someone's company makes absence noticeable. In August, the pressure from Drummond escalated. 2 of her irrigation ditches were blocked deliberately with packed earth and stone, which she discovered on a Monday morning, and spent most of the day clearing with her back aching and her temper at a slow, contained boil. A week later, one of her horses, not Conquest, the bay, but the younger roan she'd been bringing along for field work, was found limping with a piece of wire wrapped around its pastern in a way that could not have been accidental. She treated the horse's leg with the careful competence she had for all of her animals, wrapped it in clean cloth, and then sat on the fence and looked across the distance toward Drummond's operation and let herself feel the anger properly for a full minute, which was all she would allow it. She went to the sheriff again. Dan Prout was sympathetic and frustrated and hamstrung, and she left his office knowing the situation as well as she had known it going in. She came home to find Gideon Keene on her porch. He was sitting on the step, not in a presuming way, just waiting, and when she rode up he stood. "I found the wire," she said before he could speak. "I took care of it." "I know you did," he said. He paused. "I wanted to say something, and I want to say it plainly." She tied Conquest to the post and turned to face him. "All right. I've watched what's been happening," he said, "and I know you're capable of handling it, and I know you'd rather not be told what to do. I'm not going to do that." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know that what's happening to you is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that isn't just about business or land. It's the kind of wrong that's been done to small people by big people in this territory for a long time, and I have seen it, and I am angry about it on your behalf. Not because I think you need me to be, just because I am." Adelaide was still for a moment. "That is plain," she said. "I also want to ask," he said, "if you would allow me to ride with you when you're checking the south pasture and the irrigation lines. Not to protect you. You're capable. But because 2 people are a deterrent in a way that 1 person isn't, and because Whoever is doing this should know that it's not going unnoticed. She considered him. The summer light was sharp and clean, and there were dust devils spinning at the edge of the south pasture, and somewhere down in the creek a quail was making its particular kind of noise, and Adelaide Merriweather stood in all of this and understood that she was being offered something that was not rescue. "That's a reasonable proposal," she said. "I thought you'd respond to reasonable," he said, and again the corner of his mouth moved. "Don't push your luck," she said. He laughed, a full, easy laugh, not a polite one, and the sound of it opened something in the air. They fell into a pattern after that, the kind that builds itself without being decided. She checked the south pasture and the irrigation lines in the early mornings, and he was frequently there or nearby, and sometimes they worked together, and sometimes they simply occupied the same general territory, and that was enough. He came to supper twice more in August, and she found that she was cooking with slightly more intention on those evenings, though she would have been unable to explain to anyone's satisfaction why. On a Thursday evening near the end of August, with the stars coming out in their full territorial abundance overhead and the air finally cooling after a brutal day of heat, they sat on the porch after supper and she asked him something she had been not asking for weeks. "Why did you choose Parsons Creek?" she said. "There are other parcels, better water, some of them, flatter ground." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark. "The land felt right," he said. "That's not a complete answer," she said. Another pause. "I'd heard about the Merriweather homestead before I came to Cimarron," he said, "from a man in Las Vegas. He said there was a woman running 160 acres alone in the high desert north of town, and that she'd been doing it for 3 years, and that she knew the land as well as anyone in the territory. He said if you wanted to understand a piece of country, you'd do well to neighbor someone who already did." He paused again. "I thought that was sound advice." Adelaide was looking straight ahead at the dark. "That's a complicated way of saying you chose the land because of me," she said. "It's an accurate way of saying I chose the land because of what I'd heard about you," he said carefully, "which is a different thing. I didn't know you." "And now you do," she said. Her own words from the land office coming back. "And now I do," he said softly. "Seems like." The silence after that was the kind that had weight to it, warm and still. He did not move closer. He did not reach for her hand. He simply sat beside her in the dark, close enough that she could feel the steady warmth of him, and let whatever this was exist without naming it or grabbing at it. She was grateful for that. She thought that might be the most important thing, the fact that he seemed to understand that with her, patience was not a strategy. It was a respect. In the first week of September, Carlyle Drummond made his final move, and it was a bolder one than Adelaide had anticipated. She received a second letter, this one through an actual lawyer from Santa Fe named Beaumont, and this letter was considerably less delicate than the first. It alleged through language so carefully constructed as to be technically deniable, that the original filing of Thomas Merriweather's Homestead Act claim in 1874 had contained a documentation irregularity, and that there was therefore a question as to whether the claim had been legally perfected, and that pending resolution of this alleged question, which Drummond's interests were prepared to raise formally with the Territorial Land Office, Miss Merriweather might find that her continued possession of the land was on uncertain footing. It was, Adelaide understood immediately, a legal attack designed not necessarily to succeed, but to be expensive enough and exhausting enough that she would prefer to sell. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter for a long time. She was frightened, and she did not pretend to herself that she was not, because Adelaide was practical about her own emotions the way she was practical about everything else. She was also furious in that cold, steady way, and she was thinking. She rode to Cimarron the next morning and spoke with the only lawyer in town, a man named Elias Burke who was competent if not brilliant, and who went pale when she showed him the Drummond letter and then squared his shoulders in a way she respected. "I won't sugarcoat it," Elias said. "If they file a formal challenge it will take time, months possibly. The records are in Santa Fe." He paused. How solid are the original filings? My father was a thorough man, Adelaide said. But I haven't seen the complete file. We'd need the receipts of entry, the proof of improvement filings, the 5-year completion certificate, Elias said. If those are all in order, the challenge fails. But getting that documentation and presenting it while Drummond's lawyers stall, that's a process that costs money. Adelaide thought about her savings, which were modest. How much time do I have before they can do anything I can't undo, she asked. If they file, maybe 60 days before a hearing, Elias said. You'd need a lawyer in Santa Fe to handle the territorial proceedings. He named a figure. She absorbed it. She thanked him. She rode home. She was unsaddling Conquest when she heard Gideon's horse coming up from the east, and he appeared at the fence-line fence and dismounted when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the letter, plainly all of it, without softening or editorializing. He listened without interruption until she was done. "The filings are solid," she said. "I believe they are. My father was careful, but proving it quickly enough and against a Santa Fe lawyer is money," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have some," he said. She looked at him sharply. "No, Adelaide." His voice was still even, but there was something under it. "I will not take your money," she said. "I'm not." She stopped, because the thing she was about to say was the closest she had ever come to saying out loud the thing she most feared, which was that taking help meant needing help, and needing help meant being the kind of person whose survival depended on someone else's goodwill, and goodwill was the most fragile currency in the world. He waited. He let her stop. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you're not asking. I know you don't want it." He paused. "Can I tell you something?" "Apparently you're going to," she said. "If our situations were reversed," he said, "and it was my land and my father's homestead and my years of work that some man with lawyers was trying to take through a paperwork attack, I would want someone to offer. I wouldn't want to need it, but I would want someone to be the kind of person who offered." He held her gaze. "I'm not trying to make you something you're not. I'm not trying to make you smaller. I want your land to stay yours. That's all this is." Adelaide looked at him for a very long time, this man who kept refusing to be what she expected him to be. "It would be a loan," she said, "documented, with terms." "Whatever terms you set," he said. "Interest," she said. "If that's what you want," he said. "It is," she said, "and you'll have it back before winter." "All right," he said. She went inside and wrote out the terms on a piece of paper with the careful, precise handwriting her mother had made sure she had, and he signed it without reading it first, which she noticed, and then she looked at him. "You should have read that," she said. "I trust you," he said simply. She did not know what to do with that, so she folded the paper and put it in the box on the mantel where she kept important documents, and then she said, "Supper's in an hour if you want it." "I want it," he said. Elias Burke wrote to the Santa Fe lawyer and the Territorial Land Office simultaneously, and he found a colleague in Santa Fe who took the case on the strength of Elias' referral and the quality of the documentation Adelaide produced, because her father had, in fact, been as careful as she believed, and every piece of paper from the original filing to the 5-year proof of improvement was present, dated, witnessed, and filed correctly. The Drummond challenge, when it came in mid-September, was met with a response so thorough and so well documented that the hearing in October lasted 2 hours and resulted in a formal dismissal of the challenge. Adelaide paid Elias Burke. She paid the Santa Fe lawyer. She sat down with her accounts and wrote a repayment note for Gideon and had the full amount back to him by early November, as she had said, with the agreed interest. He tried to give the interest back. She would not let him. "Those were the terms," she said. "The terms were too generous," he said. "They were the terms I set," she said. "You agreed to them." He gave up, which she appreciated. The Drummond matter was not entirely resolved. The man still ran his ranch south of town and was still acquiring land where he could, but he did not approach Adelaide Merriweather again. Perhaps he decided the cost was too high. Perhaps, as Martha Calloway theorized with considerable satisfaction, the fact that Adelaide had beaten him clearly and publicly in a legal proceeding made her a less attractive target than someone who might waver. Either way, the threat receded, and the fall came in clean and cold and brilliant across the high desert, and Adelaide harvested her corn and put up her preserves and mended her south pasture fence properly and for good, and she breathed in a way she had not breathed since spring. And something else was happening, in the particular, unhurried way that things happened between her and Gideon Keene. It was not a thing she could have pointed to on any given day and said there, that moment, that is when it changed. It was more like the way the light changes through October gradually, incrementally, until one morning you notice that the angle is entirely different from what it was, and the world is rendered in gold and copper and something warm that has no name in practical language. He came to supper regularly. She went to his place twice, which was a thing she had not anticipated doing but which happened naturally. Once to help him assess a roof problem before the first rains, because she had more experience with adobe construction than he did and he asked, which was the right way to ask, and once just because she rode the eastern fence line late and his fire was burning and she stopped. She had dinner at his table in his spare, clean kitchen, and he had made a decent attempt at a beef stew that was not quite as good as hers but was respectable, and she told him so, and he laughed and said he was working on it. They talked, those evenings, in a way she had not talked with anyone in years. Not performing, not managing impressions, just speaking. She told him about her parents, about Missouri, about the crossing west when she was 17, and the way the land had looked to her then, vast and frightening and beautiful. She told him about her mother dying and the hole it left. She told him about the 3 years alone on the homestead and how she had built herself into someone who could do it, deliberately and consciously, piece by piece. "I decided I didn't need anyone," she said one evening in October, sitting at his kitchen table with the lamplight between them. "I decided it so many times it became true, or I thought it was true." He looked at her across the lamp. "And now," she held his gaze, "now I think there's a difference between not needing someone and not wanting them," she said. "I told myself they were the same thing. I don't think they are." The silence that came after that was different from the other silences between them. It was full and warm and a little frightening, the way a doorway is when you're standing at it and you can see what's on the other side. "Adelaide," he said. "Don't," she said, and then immediately, before he could respond, "Not yet." I need a moment." "Take as long as you need," he said, and she believed him because he had never once rushed her. She stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the dark, at the stars visible above the ridge of the mesa, and she thought about what she was afraid of. Not him. She was not afraid of Gideon Keene, and she was honest enough to know that. She was afraid of herself, afraid of the version of herself that had been doing perfectly fine without this, "Thank you very much," and was now standing in someone else's kitchen feeling something she hadn't planned. She was afraid of what it meant to want someone to stay. She turned around. He was sitting exactly where she'd left him, patient and still, his big hands resting quiet on the table, watching her with those gray-green eyes that held no demand. "I am not easy," she said. "I don't ask for help easily. I don't give ground easily. I have opinions about most things, and I am not inclined to pretend I don't." "I know that," he said, "and I will not," she stopped, choosing the words carefully. "I will not become less than I am in order to be someone you can be comfortable with." "I wouldn't want you to," he said. "I'm not comfortable with people who make themselves smaller. I wouldn't know what to do with that." "Then what do you want?" she asked, and the question came out rower than she intended. He stood up then, slow and deliberate, and came around the table toward her, and she did not back away, but she went very still, the way she did when something important was happening. He stopped when there was a foot of space between them. He did not close it without asking. "Can I?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had stood close enough to matter without ever once trying to take anything from her. "Yes," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, his hand barely grazing her cheek, and the gentleness of it, the careful, specific gentleness of it, undid something in her chest that she had been holding shut for years. She kissed him first. She chose to, and he received it with both hands coming up to hold her face as though she was something precious and worth keeping. And Adelaide Merriweather, who wore her independence like armor and always had, stood in that small kitchen in the October lamplight and felt the armor not remove itself but simply become lighter, because the person standing close enough to matter was not trying to take it. He was just there. November came in cold and clear, and the high desert wore its autumn colors like ceremony. Adelaide and Gideon moved through their days with a new quality to them, not changed, not different in their work or their habits or their fundamental characters, but illuminated as though the lamp had been turned up to a higher flame. They were careful with it, both of them, the way careful people are with new things. She did not suddenly require his help with everything, and he did not suddenly appear offering it unsolicited. The respect that had been the foundation of whatever this was did not shift or soften simply, because they now knew the shape of each other's face in the morning light. He came to her place for supper. She went to his. They rode the land together, sometimes hers and sometimes his, and learned each other's acres the way you learn a language you intend to keep, not for the fluency you already have but for the words you still want. He told her about Lincoln County properly, one evening in November by her fire. Told her about the war between the factions there, the Murphy-Dollin side and the Tunstall-McSween side, about men he'd known who died in it, about the particular brutality of watching law become a weapon in the hands of people who should have been bound by it. He told her about James Dollin and Lawrence Murphy and what they'd done to the small ranchers and farmers caught in the middle. People like Drummond, she said. Smaller scale, he said, but the same instinct. The belief that size and money are the same thing as right. He paused. I left Lincoln County because I didn't want to be in the middle of something like that anymore. I wanted land of my own, something I'd built. And now you have it, she said. I have it, he said, looking at her. And considerably more than I expected when I came north. She turned pink, she could feel it, which annoyed her, and looked at the fire. You are occasionally very direct, she said. You respect directness, he said. I do, she said. It doesn't mean I'm always prepared for it. He smiled, and it was the full version, the one that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and she thought privately that she could probably get used to seeing that smile every day without difficulty. In December, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the way that was entirely him. They were fixing a stretch of her north fence, of all the unromantic settings that New Mexico could have offered, on a cold, clear morning with their breath making small clouds in the air, and she had just handed him the wire stretcher, and he had just taken it and their hands had brushed, and he put the wire stretcher down and turned to face her fully. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know before I do that the answer doesn't change what's already between us. It's a question, not a requirement. She looked at him. Her heart had started a different beat. Will you marry me, he said, not because you need me and not because I need to take care of you, but because this, he gestured between them, a rare, unguarded gesture, because I want to spend the rest of my life within range of this, of you, of what you are. Adelaide looked at him for a long time. The cold wind moved through the juniper scrub, and the creek was a line of silver below the ridge, and the mountains to the north were wearing their first winter snow. What would that look like, she said. My land stays mine. Your land stays yours, he said immediately. I make my own decisions about my own operation. You make your own decisions, he said. I wouldn't want it any other way. I've watched you do it for 8 months, and I think you're better at it than I am. You'd move here, she said, to my house. Your land would stay yours as well, but this would be home. If that's what you want, he said. She thought about it, about what it meant to want someone to stay, which she had figured out in October and had been sitting with ever since. She thought about the evenings by the fire and the mornings on the land and the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who understood it. She thought about herself at 26, standing at her father's door, certain she needed nobody. She thought about the difference between needing and choosing. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. He exhaled, she heard it, a long, released breath, and then he did the thing she had not seen him do before, the thing that told her more than any declared feeling could. He closed the space between them and held her, just held her, his arms around her and his face in her hair and the world going quiet around both of them. She let herself be held. It was not the same thing as surrender. It was better. They were married in February of 1884, in the small Methodist church on the edge of Cimarron, with Martha Calloway and Elias Burke and Gideon's brother Caleb in attendance, and old Mrs. Yazzie, who appeared at the back of the church without announcement, and sat through the whole ceremony with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know when something was happening right. Adelaide wore her mother's blue dress, altered to fit her, with her dark hair pinned, and a small spray of dried wildflowers that Martha had put together because that was the kind of woman Martha was. She carried herself down the aisle the way she carried herself everywhere, straight-backed, clear-eyed, completely herself. Gideon stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was clean and freshly pressed, and when she walked toward him his face did the thing it did, opened, lit, became the fullest version of itself, and she felt the warmth of that all the way through her, through the armor she still wore because she was still Adelaide and always would be, but the armor was lighter now and the light got in. The minister asked them the usual questions. When he came to the part about obeying, Adelaide had a brief, calm conversation with the minister prior to the ceremony that resulted in the word being replaced with the word honoring, and Gideon had been informed and had said, "Yes, obviously," in the tone of a man who had expected nothing else. They said their words to each other in the cold February church with the morning light coming through the narrow windows, and the words were simple and true, the way the best words always are. She did not cry because Adelaide did not cry in public, but her voice was lower than usual, and her hands were not entirely steady when Gideon took them. He noticed, she could tell. He held them gently, steadily, until they were. They were married, and they went home to her homestead, their homestead now, though the deed remained in her name, which was how they had agreed it would be, and they cooked supper together and talked about the spring planting and what needed doing on his property before he fully moved operations over, and it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary evening Adelaide had ever spent. They brought Gideon's horses over in March, which doubled the stable and required them to extend the corral, which they did together over the course of a warm spring weekend, and they argued about the placement of one of the posts with a specific, comfortable energy that told Adelaide more about the quality of what they'd built than any tender moment could, because it meant they were both fully themselves, and neither was diminishing for the sake of peace. Gideon was right about the post, as it turned out. She told him so. He had the grace not to gloat, which she appreciated. Spring of 1884 was better than the year before in almost every measurable way. The rains came adequately. The corn went in well. His cattle operation, moved to encompass both their parcels, produced a better return than either had managed alone, and the combined income gave them room to make improvements. A new well closer to the house, repairs to the barn that Adelaide had been putting off for 2 years, a proper chicken enclosure that finally, blessedly, stopped the hens from ranging into her kitchen garden. The Drummond question was quiet. The man had apparently focused his acquisitive attention elsewhere, and the formal defeat of his legal challenge the previous fall seemed to have established Adelaide Merriweather Keene. She used both names, with a hyphen, which people in Cimarron accepted after only a brief period of adjustment, as someone who was considerably more trouble to target than she was worth. She was quietly satisfied by this. On a warm evening in May, a full year after Gideon had ridden into Cimarron on his gray horse, Adelaide was sitting on the porch watching the sunset do extraordinary things to the mesa and the sky, and Gideon came out of the house and sat beside her and handed her a cup of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the evening settling around them. "Do you ever regret it?" she said. Not anxiously, she asked the way she always asked, directly. "What specifically?" he said. "The fence line approach," she said. The very long process of becoming my neighbor before you were anything else. He considered this with his usual thoughtfulness. No, he said. I think if I'd done anything differently, you would have been right to send me off. I probably would have, she said. And I would have deserved it, he said. She leaned against him, which was a gesture she had come to permit herself with the same gradual, deliberate process by which she permitted herself most things, and felt him settle his arm around her shoulders in response. I used to think independence was a wall, she said, something you built to keep people out. And now, he said, which was the question he always asked, now I think it's more like a foundation, she said. The stronger it is, the more it can hold. It doesn't have to keep people out. It just has to be real. He turned and pressed his lips to the top of her head, briefly and warmly. That might be the smartest thing I've heard anyone say, he said. I have smart moments occasionally, she said. He laughed, and she felt the rumble of it against her side, and the mesa held all its colors for a long, suspended moment before the sun finally descended behind it. In early August of 1884, Adelaide was fairly certain she was expecting a child, and she spent 3 days being more than usually quiet before she told Gideon, who was mending tack on the porch one evening, because she was Adelaide and she needed to think about things before she said them. He put down the leather he was working and looked at her with a focus that was not alarm but intensity. "Are you well?" he said, which was his first question, which she noted. "I believe so," she said. "Yes." He stood up and crossed to her and held her face in his hands, that specific gesture that was his, and looked at her. "Adelaide," he said, and there was something in it that she had never heard in quite that way before, a depth of feeling so simple and honest that it bypassed all her careful defenses and went directly into the part of her she had kept locked for years. "Don't get emotional," she said, which she said because the alternative was doing it herself. "I'm allowed to be emotional," he said, and his voice was rough with it. "This is a legitimate occasion." She put her hands over his and held them there and closed her eyes for just a moment, and the world was warm and still and full. "All right," she said. "You're allowed." She had a son in late March of 1885, after a labor that was long and difficult, and attended by the midwife from Cimarron and by Gideon, who sat outside the door for 8 hours with the particular controlled anxiety of a man who is doing everything he can by doing nothing, and who came in the moment he was allowed to find Adelaide exhausted and sharp-eyed in the bed, holding a red-faced, furious, entirely present small person. They named him Thomas James Keene Merriweather, after her father and his, and the hyphenation of the last name was applied to him as well, which people in Cimarron eventually stopped commenting on. Gideon held his son for the first time with the same steadiness he brought to everything, but Adelaide saw the moment when that steadiness broke, just briefly, his eyes closing and his face changing into something unguarded and raw and entirely new, and she understood that she was watching him fall open in a way she had never seen before. She watched him hold their son and felt something she did not have a name for, a love that was different from any other love she knew, because it was made of more than one thing. The love for the child, yes, but also the love for the man she could see in that moment. The man who had ridden into Cimarron on a gray horse and chosen the land next door and fixed her fence and offered help in the form of presence rather than pressure, and who had stood close enough to matter without ever once trying to remove what she was. "He's loud," Gideon said, because the baby was still objecting forcefully to being in the world. "He's mine," Adelaide said. "What did you expect?" Gideon laughed, and Thomas objected louder, and outside the window the spring was coming in across the high desert in long, warm waves, and the land that Adelaide had kept was blooming. The years that followed were the years that built themselves, the kind where one season leads to another with the particular steady logic of things that are planted well. Cimarron grew slowly, the way territory towns did. A new doctor arrived in 1886, and a school opened in 1887 that Adelaide helped establish by the not inconsiderable method of attending every planning meeting, having strong opinions about the curriculum, and contributing a substantial portion of the funds from the sale of that year's surplus alfalfa crop. She served on the school board, which nobody thought was surprising once they'd thought about it for a moment. Thomas grew into a boy with his father's steadiness and his mother's intensity and both their stubbornness in full measure, and by his 3rd year of life, he was already attempting to ride the smallest horse, which Adelaide allowed because she had been riding at 3 herself, and which Gideon supervised with a careful attentiveness that she found, more than once, quite affecting. In 1887, when Thomas was 2 and Adelaide was 30 years old, and the land was producing as well as it ever had, Drummond sold his ranch and left the territory, which was reported in the Cimarron paper in a brief notice that Adelaide read twice, and then set aside without comment but with a private, comprehensive satisfaction. In 1888, their 2nd child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Rose, after Adelaide's mother, who had blue curtains in her kitchen and a laugh that Adelaide could still hear clearly if she tried. Clara was born in April, healthy and loud and with a head of dark hair that matched her mother's, and Thomas received her with the solemn, proprietary interest of a 3-year-old who has been told he is a big brother and takes this title entirely seriously. The homestead expanded that year, Gideon and Adelaide together, because their parcels were both in good standing, and the operation had grown to the point where they needed more range, acquiring an additional 80 acres to the north through a proper and uncontested purchase from an immigrant family who had decided the territory was not for them. The combined land was now 340 acres of high desert range, well-watered, well-kept, and belonging entirely and legally to Adelaide and Gideon Keene Merriweather in joint tenancy, which the land office recorded and which no one was in a position to challenge. Old Mrs. Yazzie came by the homestead that autumn with her granddaughter to trade, as she had done for years, and she looked at the expanded operation, and at the 2 children running in the yard, and at Adelaide and Gideon standing at the gate, and she said something in her own language that Adelaide did not entirely follow but whose warmth was perfectly clear. "She says the land is happy," the granddaughter translated. "Tell her I believe it," Adelaide said. Mrs. Yazzie looked at her with bright, sharp eyes and said something else. "She says you were always going to be all right," the granddaughter said. "She says she knew it when she first traded with you. She says you had the kind of face that doesn't give up." Adelaide held her gaze, this woman who had been a quiet presence in her life for years, who had brought rabbits and pottery and knowledge freely and asked for fair trade and offered, in her way, a kind of friendship that Adelaide had valued more than she had sometimes said. "Thank her," Adelaide said. "Tell her that she stopped, because what she wanted to say was complicated and she wasn't sure the translation would carry all of it. Tell her that her friendship has been one of the good things, one of the things that helped." Mrs. Yazzie listened to the translation and smiled a real smile, wide and warm, and then she looked at Gideon, who had been standing quietly beside Adelaide in the way he always did, close and still. She said something brief and pointed at him. "She says he's a good man," the granddaughter said, and there was amusement in her voice. "She says he knows how to stand without leaning on someone." Adelaide glanced at Gideon, who was looking faintly pleased. "Tell her she's not wrong," Adelaide said. In the evenings of that year and the years that followed, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet in the particular deep quiet of the high desert night, Adelaide and Gideon sat together on the porch the way they had sat for years now, and the conversation was sometimes about the land and the cattle and the school board and the neighbors, and sometimes it was about larger things, the territory applying for statehood, the changes coming through the country, the newspapers from back east that Martha Calloway passed along, the world running forward at a pace that sometimes seemed to have nothing to do with this land. And sometimes they said nothing at all, just sat in the accumulated warmth of everything they had built, and Adelaide looked at the stars and felt the presence beside her and thought about the woman she had been at 26, standing alone at her door, certain she needed no one. She had not been wrong to be that woman. She had needed to be that woman. She had needed to know, completely and without doubt, that she could stand alone before she could choose, with open eyes and a full heart, not to. She wore her independence still. She would wear it always. It was not a thing that love removed or diminished or replaced. It was, as she had said on the porch that first May evening with Gideon, a foundation, and what she had built on it was not less herself but more, wider, richer. The kind of thing a life could become when you stopped protecting yourself from its best possibilities. In the spring of 1890, New Mexico Territory was moving steadily toward statehood, and Cimarron was a different town than it had been in 1883, fuller and more complicated, and with a school that had 23 students in it, including Thomas Keene Merriweather, who was 5 years old and had already informed his teacher that he intended to be a surveyor, which his father said showed good judgment, and his mother said showed a reasonable degree of ambition that she would not discourage. Clara was nearly 2 and had recently discovered that she could climb the fence posts, which had created a set of challenges that Adelaide handled with the same practical authority she brought to everything, and which Gideon found quietly hilarious in a way he was careful not to express too openly, because Adelaide had eyes in the back of her head. One evening in April, with the desert in its extraordinary spring color, the wildflowers coming up in great sweeps of yellow and purple across the land, the cottonwoods along the creek leafing out in their bright, new green, Adelaide was in the kitchen garden, the one her mother had first planted in Missouri soil, and she had carried the idea of out to New Mexico. And she was working in the particular companionable quiet of a late afternoon when Gideon came around the side of the house and sat on the garden fence and watched her. She worked without acknowledging him for a while because she was Adelaide and because she was actually thinking about something and needed to finish thinking before she spoke. "What?" she said when she was ready. "Nothing," he said, "just watching." She looked up at him, this man who was 47 days away from his 37th birthday and who had gray at his temples now and laugh lines at the corners of those gray-green eyes, and who sat on her fence in the spring evening with the ease of a man completely at home in his own life. "I was thinking," she said, "about whether there are any women on the school board in Santa Fe." "Not that I've heard," he said. "I thought so," she said, and went back to her planting. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you thinking about Santa Fe?" "I'm thinking about the fact that there should be women on the school board in Santa Fe," she said. "I'm thinking about the fact that when New Mexico becomes a state, which it will, someone is going to need to make sure the conversations about public education include the people most concerned with it, which are mothers, not just legislators." She pressed a seed into the earth with purposeful care. "I'm thinking about what is possible and what needs doing." Gideon said nothing for a moment, and then he said, with the fullness of someone who has had the right answer ready for a long time, "What do you need?" Adelaide sat back on her heels and looked at him. What did she need? Not what should she do, not what did he think, not what was sensible or cautious or suited to a woman of her station. What did she need? She smiled at him, and it was the full version, the rare, warm, completely unguarded one that she gave only when she was entirely herself with someone, which she was with him always, without effort any more. "Time," she said, "and your very competent assistance with the children when I need to correspond or travel." "Done," he said without hesitation. She nodded, satisfied. They sat together in the garden as the evening light came down over the mesa, and the children's voices carried from somewhere around the barn, and the creek ran its silver note through the quiet, and the land held all of them in its enormous, ancient patience, and what Adelaide felt was not the absence of difficulty. There would always be difficulty. She knew that. She had always known that, but the presence of enough. Enough land, enough work, enough color in the sky and warmth in the fire, and weight in the silence when someone who understood her sat beside her and let her be exactly what she was. She had worn her independence like armor because she had needed to, and she still wore it, but it had become something different than armor now. It had become the truest version of herself, the thing she had built through years of alone and necessity, and it had not been taken from her or softened by love. It had been seen, fully, clearly, and without reservation. Gideon Keene had not tried to remove it. He had simply stood close enough to matter, and in doing so, had become the kind of presence that made the world larger rather than smaller, and the life she had built more fully her own rather than less. Thomas came running around the corner of the house with Clara on his heels, small and determined and already alarming in her single-mindedness. And Gideon dropped off the fence and caught Thomas mid-run and swung him up. And Thomas shrieked with the particular delight of a child who has been caught by someone safe. And Clara reached her father's knee and held on and demanded, at full volume, equal treatment, which she received. Adelaide watched her family in the spring evening light of 1890, on the land she had kept and grown and built into something her father would have recognized and her mother would have loved, and felt the full, quiet weight of a life that had gone the way she had made it go, not easily, not without cost, not without years of alone and years of learning, but honestly and on her own terms, and with the extraordinary, specific grace of someone who had walked through the door only when she chose to, and had found, on the other side, exactly what she had never let herself want until she was certain she could stand without it. Gideon caught her eye over Thomas's head, over the noise and the warmth and the particular beautiful chaos of a family in the early evening, and his expression was everything, the fullness, the steadiness, the light, and she held his gaze for a long moment and gave him back the same. The sunset took its time over the New Mexico mesa, the way it always did, slow and elaborate and unconcerned with the smallness of any human moment beneath it. The land was still. The creek ran. The wildflowers held the last warmth of the day in their yellow and purple cups, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a bird was practicing something complicated. Adelaide Merriweather Keene put down her gardening tools and stood up and went to her family, and the armor she wore was light as feathers, and the life she lived was entirely and completely her own, and she was home.